Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
The Princess in the Oak Tree Cottage, Chapter 2. Weeks passed as Sigmund visited Olivia in her oak tree cottage day by day. Every night he would bring her gifts of food and drink, which she loved. They spent their days talking and reading books together, exploring the forest. At first, the prince was nervous about being alone with such a beautiful girl, but Olivia had quickly put him at ease. She was kind, intelligent, and funny. Her sharp wit made him laugh, and her sparkling eyes melted his heart. Soon, the prince found himself falling deeply in love with the beautiful princess. One day, as they walked through the forest, Sigmund noticed a strange sound coming from above them. A low, thrumming noise filled the air, which sounded almost like a giant heartbeat. It reminded him of a song he'd once heard while traveling through the mountains. He stopped walking. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Olivia looked up at the sky. "I hear something," she said. "What is it?" "It sounds like a drum," Sigmund replied. Suddenly, the entire forest seemed to shake. Dust fell from the trees, and leaves rained down on the ground below. Sigmund covered his head with his hands as a loud clanging echoed across the land. The sound grew louder until it became deafening, shaking the very roots of the oak trees. The prince gasped as he saw the top branches of the oak tree begin to bend and sway. A large black shadow fell from the sky. An enormous creature landed in the center of the clearing. Its massive wings folded tightly against its body. A pair of glowing red eyes stared down at them, as if it was searching for something. Sigmund jumped back, startled by the sight before him. The creature was huge, much larger than any dragon he'd ever seen. Its skin shimmered darkly, like watery obsidian. In the center of its chest, a pulsing red light shone brightly, like a small sun. As it opened its mouth, Sigmund could see rows of razor-sharp teeth lining each side of its jaw. The monster let out another thunderous roar, and Sigmund's ears rang. Then suddenly, the beast began to shrink. Its size shrank rapidly, shrinking into nothingness. The monster vanished entirely, leaving only a faint lingering smell behind. Sigmund blinked several times, trying to make sense of what he'd just witnessed. "Did you see that?" he gasped. "Yes," Olivia replied. "That was quite the feat of magic." "Magic?" Sigmund echoed. "But how? I mean, why?" "I don't know," the princess admitted. "Maybe it wasn't really a monster after all. Maybe it was just a spell cast by someone." "Someone?" Sigmund asked. "Who might that be?" He glanced around the clearing, looking nervously toward the forest. "I think we better get back to the cottage. We shouldn't wander around here too long." "Agreed," Olivia said. They started walking back toward the oak tree. As they did, Sigmund continued to stare up at the sky. Something about what he'd seen still didn't feel right. A few minutes later, the two of them arrived back at Olivia's cottage. As soon as the doors swung open, Sigmund gasped. There was a horrible stench hanging over the entire place. It smelled like rotting meat, and it made his stomach churn. The king and queen were inside, waiting, along with the royal guards. They stood silently in the doorway, watching Sigmund and the princess enter. The prince immediately noticed the strange odor, and his face turned pale. "What happened?" he whispered. "Is everyone okay?" Olivia looked at her parents sadly. "No, I'm afraid not." Sigmund looked at Olivia, bewildered. "What's going on around here?" he asked. Olivia replied, "I haven't been completely honest with you. Much in this forest isn't as it seems. Even the king and queen, my royal parents, are not who they seem to be. For ages, this forest has been enchanted by a witch. It started when people of the villages in the forest began disappearing, but would return different, almost as though they were hollow, like puppets. Sigmund looked at the king, queen, and the guards, and back to Olivia. The smell in the cottage was unbearable. The eyes of Olivia's parents and the guards seemed dull and lifeless. Without a trace of movement, it seemed as though they came gradually closer to Sigmund and Olivia. Sigmund could hardly believe what he was experiencing. "We have to leave," said the princess. "It's no longer safe in the cottage." The two backed away toward the front door, exited, and quickly made their way to a clearing in the forest. When they were sure they weren't being followed, they stopped to catch their breath. "I'm sorry, I should have told you sooner," said the princess. "When people started disappearing and returning different than when they left, life seemed to go on the same, but over time, more and more people had changed until eventually I was the only one I could be sure was the same." Breathing in the sweet, fragrant air of the forest was relieving, but reminded Sigmund of the awful stench he had just escaped. "Does that terrible smell have anything to do with the changes?" he asked. "I noticed it earlier when the beast descended upon us in the forest before it disappeared." "It has to be," she replied. "A smell as vile as that can only come from something as vile as the witch responsible for it. Some say the witch was born straight from a pit in the earth. Wherever she is, rot follows. Whenever she leaves, she takes life with her." Sigmund looked at her curiously. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. The princess turned away from him, light filtering through the trees onto her auburn hair crowned with flowers, not saying a word. "How long have you been alone in this cottage?" he asked. Olivia turned to Sigmund and locked eyes with him. He could see tears welling at the corners of her emerald green eyes. Finally, the princess responded, 300 years. "I told you I'd been waiting for you."